Of course, the Cabinet Office Minister Francis Maude, and he joins me now from West Sussex. A very good morning to you, Mr. Maude. We'll get on to that business in a moment or two, but first of all, your thoughts about Afzal Amin, the suspended Conservative candidate in Dudley North. Now, you'll remember, I remember, just at the end of last week, Mr. Cameron talking about UKIP's troubles in this respect with some of its candidates as catastrophic blunders, disasters and missteps. You've rather been hoisted with the same petard.
Well, it's a really serious allegation, and it needs to be, and he's been suspended, obviously, from the party. And there's going to be a proper hearing on Tuesday where he'll have a chance to explain himself. But, you know, on the face of it, it's a really serious allegation, which we're taking extremely seriously.
But is it the case with 600 plus candidates in the general election that some of them are always going to, let's say, have a few missteps, to paraphrase the Prime Minister?
Well, we hope not. And obviously this is a serious issue, and it's being tackled with proper gravity.
OK, well, on to what you achieved in the Cabinet Office during the past 5 years. Is that fair, the description I gave you there, that you are, in a sense, the backroom boy of austerity? You've delivered an awful lot of those savings.
Well, we've done a lot. It shouldn't have been that. There shouldn't have been that much to save. But you know, between 1997 and 2010, the ONS to say that public sector productivity remained completely flat, and if it had improved by the same rate as productivity in the private sector had improved, then the deficit would have been halved. We started with this huge deficit. People sometimes forget that we were spending £4 for every £3 in revenue. We were having to borrow £1 in every 4 that we were spending, and you can't carry on like that. So the choice you have then is, are you just going to cut services, or are you going to do what any sensible household or business would do, which is to cut your costs? And that's what we've done. The civil service is now 21% like-for-like smaller than it was in 2010. We've got out of huge amounts of property that we didn't need. We've buying much better from our suppliers, but negotiating much better terms. I spent the summer of 2010 negotiating with the government's biggest suppliers. The data we had was terribly poor. It was very difficult to find out who our biggest suppliers were. But when we found out, we had very productive conversations. While many others were on the beach, I was in a warm room in Whitehall renegotiating contracts. So this is all stuff that is perfectly common sense.
Sorry, Mr. Maude, just to put a figure on it, how much do you estimate your work within the civil service and the public sector has saved over the course of this Parliament?
Well, if you add it all up, it would be well over £50 billion. But, I mean, just in last year alone, it was £14.3 billion, compared with Labour's last year in office. Our ambition was to achieve, in the final year of the Parliament this year, just coming to an end, over £20 billion. And we're certainly on track to exceed that.
But is there more to come? I mean, people want to know overall about the cuts.
Yes.
Do you think there's more fat to go for if you're elected in the next Parliament?
Yes, there is, and there's no doubt about that. We've set out that we think by 2017-18 we can save another £10 billion annually, and by 2019-20, by the end of the next Parliament, we should be able to save somewhere between 15 and 20 billion compared with this year. And that is absolutely achievable. There are so many ways of doing things differently. Moving services online, for example, where, you know, the British government used to be a sort of byword for unsuccessful IT programs. Now, actually, the world is coming to us to see how to do things. You know, the US government has set up a digital service which they've explicitly modelled on our government digital service, GDS. The Australian government has done the same, but we're only at the beginning of this. The digital transformation is only in its infancy so far as government's concerned. We still have very expensive IT contracts left over from Labour's years, which come to an end, many of them over the coming years. And we think we can save, on that alone, at least £4 billion a year by the end of the Parliament. So there's much, much more that can be done. And so we're working very hard still, preparing very hard to drive those savings through, because I think that's what people want. Okay. People do understand that you can't carry on spending money you don't have.
Right,
I think that people recognise as a part of the government's long-term economic plan, we do have to get rid of the government's deficit, the budget deficit. But they'd much rather it was done by cutting the costs of government rather than by cutting the services. What we've shown over this time is that you can get more public service and better public services for less money, but we're only at the beginning of this.
All right. I am going to interrupt Mr. Maude because we do want this to be a two-way interview. And what I want to do is ask you, well, OK, after the budget, we found out that the cuts are going to be more or less front-loaded to achieve that surplus, slightly smaller surplus by the end of the Parliament under Mr. Osborne's plans of £7 billion. I mean, you're basically telling us as a party that the worst is still to come after what we've been through. Well, it isn't the worst, you see. These savings are not savings that will hurt the public. These are savings that will benefit the public because what it will enable the government to do is to focus the spending on the front-line services on which people, particularly vulnerable people, depend. So I don't regard this as the worst. This is basic stuff. You see, when I explain what we're doing to people in the business world, they don't seem particularly astonished. The only thing that's astonishing is that government hasn't done this before. So there is much more that we can do in this. We can save money. As the Chancellor said in his budget on Wednesday, you know, we've achieved our savings in what the government does through efficiency and reform, not through cutting services. Obviously there are savings in welfare, and those have been explained, and the Chancellor said there's more to come there. But in terms of the government's own spending, we can and should absolutely focus those savings on the costs of government, how, you know, our running costs, not on the services and
on which people depend.
Are those techniques you've learned, and as you say, business have endorsed them and are surprised that they haven't been applied across the board? You know, I've often heard business leaders talk, for instance, about the National Health Service. I mean, clearly the skills you've learned, the techniques you've evolved during the last 5 years, many of them would apply, would they not, to the NHS?
Yes, in many cases they do. And there is much more that we can do. And Jeremy Hunt's been absolutely clear about that. For example, procurement. We can, by buying in one place, using the scale and the volume to drive down cost and price, we can save money there. And then deploy that money in the health service much more in the frontline medical and clinical services, which are what the NHS is all about. But there are different ways of doing things, and all of these techniques are applicable in the health service as well. I talked about us cutting the size of the civil service, but we have already cut the size of the bureaucracy in the NHS while increasing the number of doctors and nurses in the NHS. And that's the balance that we want. It's the money being spent on the people who do the frontline work, not on the costs of running the system.
OK, and just finally, Mr. Maude, I want to ask you, of course, your thoughts about standing down at this election, as we've discussed in the last few minutes. You clearly feel there's a lot more work to do. Is this something you want, a project you want to continue with, perhaps from the House of Lords? Well, look, I mean, not for me to speculate about my future, but there is a huge amount still to do. And what I'm doing now is working really hard to ensure that whoever is in post, and I deeply hope and I'm optimistic that it'll be a Conservative government after May the 7th, that's as well prepared as it can be to continue this work, because this is what people are entitled to expect, that the government will cut its own costs first to protect and promote the frontline services on which people depend. But is it, OK, let me rephrase that, is that you done with politics after this general election, or do you still aim to have some kind of influence? Well, politics and public service are deep in my DNA. It's what I spent most of my adult life doing. So I'd be very surprised if I'm saying goodbye to it all forever. But exactly how I'm involved is a matter not for me. But there is still a huge amount of work to do in this area. OK, watch this space then. Francis Maude, thank you very much indeed, Cabinet Office Minister for the time being. And you're watching Murganhan.